see, or you see some hands up. If you have a question, put your hand up.
Hi, Professor Rodrick. My name is Robin. I'm a master's student here in the Urban and Regional Policy program at Northeastern. And my question is, isn't the political trilemma, or how is the political trilemma similar, and how is it different to the dilemma faced by the states when we were forming our United States here? And might that be an example for how we could solve the global trilemma?
I think that's an excellent question. I think the choice is that the world, I'm not going to use community because that prejudges the answer. There's a set of nations in the world who get together and meet in the G20 and the IMF and the World Trade. That's exactly the kind of question that they confront. The question they confront is to what extent do they form a true political community to the point where they want to have a jointness of institutions and a set of decision-making at the global level, realizing fully well that that's going to significantly constrain their ability to do things differently at the national level. And that's the choice that was essentially the fulcrum of the debate in the United States around the Constitutional Convention. And of course, there was a very strong view that lost out ultimately of having a very, very weak central government. The federal government in the United States is not strong by the standards of many other centralized nations, but still, it obviously was much stronger than what had come before. And it's a debate that goes on in the United States that we see. But ultimately, I think the decision in the United States was that we were one nation. And I think saying that makes obvious how high the bar is at the global level. It is a relevant contemporary example is the European Union. Right? The European Union is probably the set of countries that has come closest to achieving this global governance at a regional level. Because after all, there's a common legal structure. There's a European Court of Justice. There's a common set of standards and regulations that now exceed 100,000 pages issued from Brussels. A bunch of them have a common currency, the Eurozone. Right? And you can see how difficult that process is, because as much as they share, most of them, a common historical trajectory, very similar levels of development compared to the world at large. We see just today, as we speak, with the troubles that Greece is suffering. Right? Germany is not telling Greece that it should go to the IMF. Germany is part of the Eurozone. It's a member of the European Union. It's sort of like the federal government telling California that it has to get approval from the IMF before Californians can have access to the federal recovery funds. Right? So that's essential. So you can see how, when you think about the analogy, how difficult it is even for the nations of Europe, and how much more difficult it is for the globe as a whole, given these very big differences in political and institutional aspirations.
Let me take the privilege. Let's follow that up, Dani, with, let's say, the following question. Your very first slide showed pretty strong antipathy toward globalization on the behalf of many nations, not all. The United States, I think it was 72%. So now you go to the White House and you sit down with Mr. Obama and the Vice President, or you go to Germany and you sit down with Merkel, or you sit down with Gordon Brown in England, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any chance in the world that you could sell them on this model?
Well, I would hope that I could sell them that there are choices to make, to be explicit that they are making those choices. I think to sell Obama's advisors, whom we know well, who actually think along these lines, that this is a valid set of dilemmas. And then the question is how do you sell? The part that I would be much less successful at, I think, is how do you politically package what, to me, is ultimately the only sustainable model here, which is some kind of reinvented Bretton Woods compromise. Because I don't think the golden straitjacket serves any good ends. I don't think global governance, for the reasons that I just mentioned in response to the previous question, is either feasible or, more importantly, desirable, given these different aspirations. So that really leaves us only with the Bretton Woods compromise. So the question becomes, how do we rewrite the rules of world trade and world finance in ways that simultaneously leave enough room for different nations to protect their own national, institutional, and regulatory choices, without this simultaneously deteriorating into a protectionist free-for-all and sort of trade blocks and all of that. Now, I think I have the answer, and I write it, which I develop in the book. But it is, I think, what we lack is the political language that would sort of legitimize this vision and sell it. And I think we're just, all that we have right now are a series of fudges around those issues.
Thank you.
I have two questions. I think they both
Would you
are
identify
kind of...
yourself? Identify yourself.
Oh, I'm Judy Potts. I've been coming to all these classes, and thank you very much. I have two questions, and they're questions that I've had for a while regarding globalization. The first one is when I saw the first slide, and you see that 70% of Americans aren't interested in buying foreign goods. But that only applies to sneakers and blouses. It doesn't apply to the biggest ticket item that we buy, and that's a car. And no one has ever suggested, or at least that I've heard, that we only buy American cars. Witness what happened to our American car makers, whether it's their fault or ours, whatever that is. And so that strikes me as a very funny thing. You know, don't do as I say, do as I say. The other one is that when the thing about the lead paint came out, now those weren't Chinese toys that we were importing. Those were Fisher-Price toys that we were importing. The management of those companies should know what American standards are, and yet someone had to find it out. They didn't say, whoa, we want our paint done this way or that way. So I really am concerned about what globalization really is. I think we have it now, but we like to talk that we don't.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we have it, and we benefit from it, and yet, as you rightly suggest, there's a lot of unease for it. When we wear our hats as consumers, right, we go to Walmart. Walmart is what sells 90% Chinese goods, and nobody's going to keep people from from shopping in Walmart because the prices are so low. So everybody benefits from all of that, from being able to get those. But yet, when you ask people, and when they think their jobs could potentially be threatened by these, they react very differently. And they react differently when they think the threat is coming from China or India versus when they think the threat is another American. And I think it has to do with this notion that they think the playing field is somehow not quite level. So I think what we ultimately want is to be able to enjoy those fruits without creating those kinds of concerns about whether this is the degree to which this is acceptable or legitimate. Now, I think in the case of lead paint or lead painted toys, you're absolutely right. And I think probably very few people here would disagree with the idea that the right approach to that is to have very clear standards and rules about, toys that are sold in the United States must, regardless of who produces them, where they're produced, and how, must satisfy these particular lead standards. Right? And so it doesn't matter whether the toys are manufactured here or they manufactured in China, whether they're manufactured by a company that's owned by Americans, or it's a subsidiary, or it's a subcontractor. If you are doing business in the United States, you're selling toys to children in the United States, you have to abide by these kinds of rules. I think that sounds like a very, very commonsensical notion. Now, what's very interesting is that when we move to other areas, what seems like very common sense is actually not at all the common practice. So, in the case of, for example, financial standards, financial regulations, if you told Goldman Sachs that you would apply the same standards, that every nation is entitled to its own rules and regulations, and every financial entity that does business in these different national settings have to comply by these different national regulations, you think that that's crazy, that would create so much dislocation in the global financial system, and entails so much segmentation of financial markets and so much cost for them to comply with all these different regulations, that would be totally unacceptable. And I think that's not right. I think when you think about it, when you think about the parallel as to why is it something that feels so right in the case of lead paint, why is it so outlandish? Why should it be so outlandish in the case of financial regulations? So that's what I mean by sort of moving towards more of a Bretton Woods compromise kind of a world, because effectively, in the lead-painted toys case, we are applying a Bretton Woods set of rules, where we're saying each country is entitled to their own national regulations. And the reason that the toy example becomes a crisis is because we find out a case where the rules weren't enforced. But in so many other areas, including environmental and labor standards and so forth, our approach is completely different, that we should have open market, regardless of the standards under which these other goods have been produced. So I'm trying to reorient us in a way that I think we're a little bit more consistent in the way that we approach these different areas.
Hi, thank you. I'm Dave Chosiad, and a number of my gray hairs are related to dealing with different standards in different countries. Can you go back to your first slide, since that's come up both times? Now, the question at the bottom, is that the question that was indeed asked?
I'm sorry?
The question at the bottom, do you think A and B? Because that strikes me as exactly the type of question that we're told when we're told to design surveys, that we don't design them that way. It's basically A, do you like the Republican position on the health care bill? And B, do you like the Democratic idiotic position on the health care bill? Which you add B, lose jobs.
Right.
So it's not a balanced question. And which brings me to my real question, which is, it strikes me that there's a good amount of perception problem for the African American, Argentine, and Mexican, and so forth, on what globalization means to them. Do you agree? And is there any good measurements, quantifying data that really is helpful? For example, one of the things I heard three or 4 years ago, that in fact the outsourcing to India and professional services was actually bringing higher paid jobs into the U.S. Net than providing lower paid jobs in India. Do we have that data? So a perception question and a data question.
Yeah, I mean, on the perception, I think you're right that the responses that you tend to get from these surveys could vary a lot depending on how, and your sense is that this set of questions was biased towards inducing people to favor protection because they're talking about jobs being protected, and that's, has all the right signals sort of going up. True. I mean, this is in fact one of the surveys where it's least loaded in some sense in that way, because people, it's just saying, it also appeals to your, libertarian instincts. If people want to buy them, shouldn't they buy them? I mean, I think most, people would tend to think that that's a natural thing, that if I want to buy them, I should be able to buy them. But I mean, I don't deny the main point. But this is, regardless of how you phrase these questions, I think there is a very, very big gap. Again, the thing that you have to bear in mind as the benchmark is, suppose you ask the same question to people about importing goods from Rhode Island versus China. Regardless of how you pose this question, you're going to get a big difference. And that's, from an economic standpoint, you get much bigger gains from importing the goods from China because they're so much cheaper over there. You don't get a big deal from being able to trade with Rhode Island. Massachusetts could cut off all trade with Rhode Island, and nobody could even feel it. But cut off trade with China, and what would happen to everything in Walmart? I mean, it would go disappear. So that you would really feel that. Now, on the data question, there's a huge, huge literature on the actual sort of measurable effects of trade and outsourcing, and what it does to equality, what it does to real incomes, and so forth. And I think the way that I would summarize it is that in aggregate, the effects aren't huge. So if you wanted to summarize it in aggregate, in the sense of, how many points does it add to the overall widening of income inequality? Compared to everything else that's driving inequality, it's relatively small, 10-20% of the whole thing. Compared to everything that's driving job loss or job displacement, again, it's a relatively small thing. But it is not a small thing for those 10-20% of the people who actually are feeling it, and the other 20-30% who, not having felt it, think that they might be next on the line. So I think that's where I think the political saliency of this comes, and the fact is that we are at an impasse here. We are at an impasse here in the trade because we haven't had a blow up like we've had in international finance. But we've had now this trade negotiations, so-called the Doha trade negotiations under the World Trade Organization, that has been now going on for almost 10 years, and it still have to be concluded. And so there's something that's not working in the system, and it's not because everybody is very happy about it either. So I think that's the problem on the trade side. I think on the side of international finance is it keeps blowing up in our face. And so that's what we need to fix.
Hi, my name is Paula Robinson, and I work with small businesses on teaching them what globalization is about and trying to bridge a gap here. My question is, how does the internet and market trending play a role in forcing compromise and decisions with the Trilema, and whether or not quality control in the U.S. would be the way to go to protect sort of the health and well-being of the citizens, rather than so much a focus on the jobs of people. And I'm looking at the way that in Europe they protect the wine. There's quality control on wines and cheeses and things of that nature, which raise the standards, and they're extremely well sought after, and that's a world trade that's being done on a local level. If that's a plausibility when you're looking at it across nations.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are areas where So people tend to worry a lot about what's called the race to the bottom in standards. And I think you're bringing up a case where there might be the incentives for race to the bottom may not be that strong. In fact, you can maintain a market niche for yourself by developing a reputation for having high standards. And that's what a lot of European countries have been able to do. So it's certainly true that it's not always the case that globalization drives all the standards low. So when people worry about things like, since firms and investors can move around globally, it'll drive all the corporate tax rates down because every country will have to reduce its corporate taxes down to its neighbor's level because otherwise they lose all the investment. Or that all the labor standards will be eroded because if you have very high standards with respect to minimum wage or labor benefits and so forth, you'll lose jobs to other countries where the benefits and standards aren't. So those kinds of worries are all about worries about the race to the bottom. But I think you're bringing up an example where, in fact, there might be areas where you can benefit from having a sort of a different standard as long as the consumers feel that they're getting something out of it. So you can maintain those higher and more costly standards because you're sending a signal of high quality at the same time. And that's generally true in the sense that there's some concern that competition might drive labor standards in the United States somewhat lower, but ultimately because American workers are so much more productive than Chinese workers, there's always going to be room for them to be able to afford higher standards than those in China. So you have to be careful about sort of what the relevant empirical magnitudes of this are. So you might be, that this is what ultimately keeps standards and benefits high in the United States is that it's a high productivity economy, much higher than in China. So productivity is the key, is here. So that's what allows you to maintain these differences of standards in many areas. I think what the internet has done is clearly reduce these communication costs, and has been a big driver behind outsourcing, and I think has greatly expanded the kinds of things that could be outsourced into professional services in many different areas. So I think it's Alan Blinder talks about sort of the next industrial revolution, where large segments of things that were previously not traded or tradable in the United States becomes tradable. So that has the potential of creating huge amount of job displacement in the United States, where it's no longer blue-collar workers, but also professionals who educators like me, who have now sort of have to face Indians and Jamaicans who are willing to teach my course over the internet at much lower salaries than Harvard takes me. And when it hits home, it's a very different matter.
Hi, I'm Franco, economics major here in Northeastern. I wanted to go back to the European Union model and analogy that you did, because my first question was actually about the European Union, if it comes close, and you said it does. My second question is a two-part question. The first one is, if, for instance, you were standing in front of, the United Nations General Assembly, and, if this seems to be the goal, pick all three, and you could possibly have it regardless of the cost, would you recommend modeling this after the European Union? And if you do recommend it, are there any sort of changes in order to sort of scale it to the global scale that it's supposed to be?
I mean, I'm all for groupings of nations getting together and wanting to have much higher levels of economic integration among them. And I think, I view what Europe is going through is a very painful sort of two-step forward, one-step back kind of historical experience that they've embarked on, largely for political reasons, which I think is is actually, despite the current crisis, has worked reasonably well. But I just don't regard it as either practical or desirable for that model to be expanded